Hello, this is Dave Ness, pastor of North Seattle Church of the Nazarene, where this marks the fourth Sunday we've not met in our building due to the COVID-19 coronavirus. But we're making it, right? And we've all been told to stay home, stay healthy, which is what everybody has been doing for a while now. So what do you call it when you haven't been within 6 feet of anybody for 2 weeks, except for your family? And the only store you've been in for 2 weeks was a grocery store. Growing up, we called it normal. I grew up on a farm in South Dakota, which was 20 miles from town. We went to town to get groceries every couple of weeks. Our nearest neighbor was a mile away, and they didn't have any kids. If school wasn't in session, and it wasn't Sunday, so we were in church, it was pretty normal to go for a whole week and not talk to anyone except our own family. Looking back, I grew up quarantined, and so did Joy, who grew up on a farm in Nebraska. Now, there are some obvious disadvantages to this situation, but there are also some advantages to being in a situation where you're stuck at home with just your family and nobody else. For one thing, you come to really rely on and respect your family. We had one unforgettable winter when I was growing up, when we were snowed in for 3 weeks, twice. And about the time the snow arrived, so did my older sister and our cousin, who came home from college for Christmas break. They brought with them the Hong Kong flu. All of us caught it. It was all difficult and boring and hard at the time, and now I look back on that as one of my favorite boyhood memories, that winter. That winter really built character into our family. All we had was God and each other, and it was enough. Another advantage of growing up pretty much alone and isolated from everybody else is if you want to, you can have a relationship with God that is very, very personal and very, very strong, because there's nobody else to talk to. There wasn't anybody else out there to make you pray or read your Bible. And when you go for a walk down the empty gravel road at night and you start talking to God on your own, He talks back, and you learn His voice, and you fall in love with Jesus. And if you have a personal relationship with Jesus and you know how to pray, you can get through anything, even if you're only a child. And what happens, especially if you come to know Jesus as a child, is that as you grow up, so does your faith. Fortunately, you don't have to become a believer when you're a child in order to serve Jesus. My wife Joy led her grandfather to faith in Christ when he was 90. So you're never too old to trust in Jesus. But the earlier you start to follow Jesus, the better. There's nothing like knowing and loving and following Jesus Christ. It's the greatest adventure. There's nothing like it. So, quarantine can be a really good faith builder. It's also the reason we have some of our favorite parts of the New Testament. The book of Revelation was written by the Apostle John, who was in exile on the island of Patmos because he was a follower of Jesus. And of the 13 letters in the Bible written by the Apostle Paul, about half of them were written from a jail cell. That's quarantine. And of course, the Apostle Paul was in prison because he was a follower of Jesus. It had not always been that way, though, for Paul. Back when he was known as Saul, rising Pharisee, he was the number one enemy of the church and did everything in his power to stamp it out. When Saul couldn't find any more believers in Jerusalem to persecute, he journeyed to Damascus to try to persecute some more there. It was on the road to Damascus that Jesus appeared to Saul in blinding light and spoke to him. That day changed Saul forever. He became a believer in the same Jesus he had been persecuting. Faith was born in him that day. And that faith grew and grew and grew as Saul changed from a persecutor of the Christians to becoming one of the first missionaries. Saul, who now was known by his Roman name of Paul, had made 3 missionary journeys, suffered all kinds of persecution now himself for his faith, including imprisonment, and now was on his way to Rome to stand trial before Caesar himself, of course, for his faith. So you can get the picture of this whole story. I'm going to read Acts chapters 27 into chapter 28, and then we'll go back and we'll look at a couple of things we can learn from this story, which will help us in our deal. This is Acts chapter 27, reading out of the English Standard Version. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. In putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, and as the wind did not allow us to go farther, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. Now when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo, and on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship, and he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island.' When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they'd eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. After we were brought safely through, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all, because it had begun to rain and was cold. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island, named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery, and Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, healed him. And when this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They also honored us greatly, and when we were about to sail, they put on board whatever we needed. What an amazing story. Who's in charge of the ship? Who's calling the shots? The captain, right? The sailors, right? The experts? The passengers? The centurion? The leader of the soldiers? The person who's giving orders before this is over is one of the prisoners. There's a guy in chains waving his arms around saying stuff like, "Unless these sailors stay with the ship, we can't be saved." What? And the soldiers cut the ropes off the lifeboat and let it fall into the sea. Why would they listen to the prisoner giving orders that affect all of their lives? Because the prisoner has heard from God. The prisoner had faith and was obviously close to God. And right now, there weren't a whole lot of other options available to them. This was the only person on board the ship who had any faith or hope. And so all 276 of them are depending on Paul, the prisoner, to lead the way through this thing. Folks, this is a time for faith. You may be the only person in your family who has any. You may be the only family in your neighborhood who has a meaningful connection with God. This is a time for faith. Why? Because faith produces hope. The people on board that ship had run out of hope. They were scared out of their wits. They hadn't seen sun or stars for days. They had no idea where they were. At any moment, they knew that one more big wave would come over the side and that would just be it. They were so afraid. And here's this beat-up guy wearing chains who's talking about how an angel came and told him everybody's going to be getting through this thing okay, alive. And then he makes himself a sandwich in front of everybody and says, "Hey, you guys need to eat something too. God said we're going to make it. We'll be fine." Paul's faith gave the rest of his shipmates hope, and they really needed it. Your family, your friends, your neighbors, the frightened strangers you encounter, everybody needs hope right now. Everybody needs prayer, and everybody needs hope. And your faith produces hope in people around you who need some. This is a time for faith, and faith produces hope. Your faith gives hope to your neighbors and your family and your Facebook friends. And faith is rewarded. God always comes through when we trust him, always. I don't know what day it was when Paul made his speech on board the ship in the storm, but it was a while before anybody saw any evidence that these things really were going to turn out okay. I find it interesting that the Bible says that it was the 14th night when the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. 14th night. Now, how long is this stay-at-home lockdown thing supposed to be? 14 days, right? This is a time for faith. And this is a time for love. There's a time for truth, and there's a time for love. And right now, it's time for love. Unless God makes it perfectly clear what you are supposed to say and when you're supposed to say it, hold off on telling people truth they aren't ready to hear yet. and focus on just the love. Apply love. This is a time for love. No judgment, no condemnation, no accusations, no moralizing, just love. When Paul's ship landed on Malta, what did those islanders need? They needed the truth of the gospel, right? Well, they needed the truth of the gospel, but they wouldn't have been ready for it at all. What they needed was love. The islanders showed great kindness to the people on board that ship, and Paul showed kindness back. When he found that the father of the head official was sick, Paul prayed for him, laid hands on him, and healed him. And then they proceeded to bring all the sick on the whole island to Paul, and everybody got healed. I'm sure they got some of the truth of the gospel before Paul left them, but first they needed love. Before it's over, there are believers on the island of Malta. Lead with love. Save the truth for when it's going to be heard. Then and now, people who need the truth generally can't hear it if you start out with the truth. They usually need love first, and they'll let you know when they're ready for the truth. Love softens the ground for truth. This week, the Lord reminded me to be careful with the truth. To not lead with truth, but to lead with love. And wait until people are ready before applying truth. Now, why is that? A lot of people around us could be compared spiritually to people in a hospital burn unit. Many of the people around us resemble people in a burn unit. They're so sensitive to everything. Why? Well, some of them have been burned. Maybe it was by the church. Maybe they were burned by their family. Maybe they were burned by their spouse or their ex-spouse. Maybe they've just been burned by life, illnesses, hardship, unfair things which have made it difficult for them to be open at all to anything that feels the least bit spiritual. People in the burn unit are sensitive to everything, and everything hurts. They can't handle any amount of truth right now. It just hurts too much. What they need is love, healing love. No strings attached, no catch, just love. This is a time for love. And don't forget prayer. We're in a pretty strange situation these days. It's hard to know what to do. Trusting God is always a good plan. I believe this is a time for faith, which produces hope. This is a time for love, which softens the ground for truth. A ship was being driven by a storm across the Adriatic Sea. All hope was lost. They all knew they weren't going to make it. They just knew that. But God's man, Paul, the apostle prisoner, stood up and addressed the frightened people on board that ship. He told them, "An angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship stood before me. And he said, we're all going to be okay." And hope was reborn on that ship because of faith, which produces hope. This is a time for faith, which produces hope. This is a time for love, which softens the ground for truth. It's time for faith. It's time for love. And by the way, we're going to make it, God said.